Okay, probably we can start now. So, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, Dave.
Morning.
So, today we will have a guest lecture by Dr. Dave Matheson from the University of Westminster. He's a senior lecturer there, and then your PhD research is on Jakarta, right? If I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Yes, I
Okay.
just finished that.
So, without any further ado, please, Dave, you can give us the lecture for today's class. Thank you very much.
Okay, everybody. Just checking you can hear me and you can see the screen.
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, great. So, Bagas asked me to talk to you about some projects in the UK and the USA. So, hopefully, I'm going to do that. I'm going to do the way I'm going to do that is to uh, use London and New York as kind of examples of how we use urban design in those two cities. Um, oops. So I just wanted to start with just a brief overview of who I am and the institution that I come from, or where I teach, basically. Um, Westminster is like ET Bay. It's a public institution, and also like ET Bay, it is a technical university, and it was actually originally the first what's called a polytechnic in English-speaking countries. It was the first one in the UK. It was founded in 1837 as the Royal Polytechnic. And it went through a few different iterations of that, and was finally upgraded to a university in 1992. Um, we're a big university. We have about 20,000 students. Um, Approximately 15,000 of those are undergraduate, and 5,000 of those are postgraduate. One of the interesting things about us is that we're one of the most ethnically and culturally diverse universities in the world. It's a central London uh, university, and we have several different campuses. Our campus is based in Marylebone, so quite central to London. We are part of the College of Design, Creative, and Digital Industries. And as part of that, we are the School of Architecture and Cities. Just a little bit about the school. We have a strong reputation for research. We have a number of different research groups, including the two that I'm part of, which is Emerging Territories and the Max Lock Center. It's a fairly cross-disciplinary entity. So we have not only architecture, but we have transport planning, infrastructure, tourism, urban planning, and urban design. Um, we have a very strong engagement with local practice, and over 100 members of staff are engaged in research with a fairly strong doctoral research program, which Bagas has alluded to because I just recently finished my own doctoral research. Right. And then we have, in terms of urban design itself, over 40 years of experience. We've got quite a few um, academics that are pure academics, as well as people like myself that have quite a bit of experience in practice. So I came from practice before teaching. And we have a lot of practitioners that come and contribute to the program as well. And we are one of 50 courses in the UK that is specific to urban design. Of course, it's a design-based course, much like I imagine yourselves are. That means that all of our classes will involve some sort of graphic content. And we base our projects on live or current projects in London. And so our work is quite kind of quite practical. It mimics very much what you do in practice. Just a little bit about me. As I said, I come from originally from practice. I was working as a senior urban designer at SOM when I moved over to the university. So I have about 20 to 24 years of combined sort of architecture, urban design, and international development practice, as well as teaching. And I've been teaching at Westminster for the last 12 years. I'm pretty much the studio lead for not just urban design, but also international planning. I lead a module on urban morphology. And I'm also a researcher, of course, and I'm the senior tutor for the school. So to talk about London to start with, I'm going to talk about London's opportunity areas. And this is a strategic planning tool that is used in London for new urban intensification and development. Basically, if you think about a city like London, it's quite old. It's 2000 plus years old. And so it's highly developed in many respects. So the way that we have to look at the city is intervening in the existing urban form as a way of changing the city and redeveloping it. And that means that you can look at different ways of doing that. And usually, in the case of London, it has to do with intensification of urban development. So that means taking existing areas of the city and building greater height and density into them. London is very much a global city. This is a satellite image. You can see the River Thames, London Heathrow Airport to the left there. The city sort of proper is city center is in the center. And then the area to the east, which you can see is a mixture of kind of industrial, post-industrial lands. That's one of the biggest opportunity areas in London, and it's called the Thames Estuary Opportunity Area. And that's quite interesting because London, over the past 20 years, has been sort of shifting further to the east in terms of its focus of urban development. London itself is a big city. It has just under 8.9 million people living inside of the municipality. Um, we have an urban population of just under 10 million and a metropolitan population of just under 15. So we're one of the biggest cities in Europe. Um, Interesting that we closely follow New York in the US, and that's interesting because we'll be talking about that later. New York's not their metropolitan population, but their municipal population is actually less than London. It's only about 8.2 million. But then, of course, their metropolitan region is over 20 million people, so quite a bit larger than London. And then if you think about the importance of these two cities in terms of their global um, percentage of GDP is very high. Um, London, New York, and Tokyo are always sort of considered to be, the first tier world cities in terms of their share of global GDP. London has taken a bit of a hit in the last few years because the UK left the European Union, but it's been sort of clawing that back. over the last few years. So these figures are slightly old. Right. So to talk about London, one of the interesting things is, unlike other cities, other global cities, it didn't develop in a monocentric fashion. It grew up as many different towns and villages. And as a result of that, the city has many centers to it. And so it's very much seen as a city of villages. And it as a result of that, we see it very much as a polycentric city. So city of many, many smaller centers. It's an interesting time in London. There's a lot that's taking place and a lot that's changing. As you could see from the population statistics, the population is still rising. We are expecting to hit 10 million people within London's municipality within the next 10 to 15 years. And alongside that, there is a huge shortage of housing, massive housing pressures in not just London, but in the UK in general. Housing is very, very expensive here. And then, of course, tall buildings come alongside of that. And London, over the past 15 to 20 years, has been transforming from what was primarily a horizontal city into one that is becoming increasingly vertical, a place where you have many tall buildings. What's interesting about this image is every single building in this image that is above, let's say, 10 stories or so, apart from one, has been built since the year 2000. So that begins to show you how rapidly the city is changing. And then, of course, we have over 650 tall buildings in the planning system at the moment. And tall buildings in London are defined as any building over 20 stories. And this is really being driven largely by international investment. London is administratively a regional authority, so similar to Jakarta. We don't have provinces in the UK, but we do have counties, and it is also a county. And at the sort of coterminous with that county is the municipality, which is known as the Greater London Authority, or the GLA. That is headed by popularly elected mayor. The current mayor is Sadiq Khan. He just was reelected to a third term. And the GLA is comprised of 33 smaller boroughs, plus what's called the city, and that's basically the medieval city. So 34 altogether. Um, so in terms of planning in London, the mayor is tasked with the strategic planning of the city. And so there's a whole series of things that the mayor looks at. They have a city vision and various principles for good growth. I won't go into that in detail, but suffice it to say that that opportunity areas are a big part of that. And one of the reasons for looking at that is because, as I said earlier, London is already a highly developed city, so it needs to find new and innovative ways of redeveloping the lands it already has, rather than growing. And one of the things that, since the late 1940s, London has had a green belt in place, and that means that the city is restricted from physically growing larger because of that green belt, because you can't build on the green belt. One of the interesting things that has happened recently is what was called Crossrail. And this was a project that was specifically about improving east-west infrastructure and transport across the capital. When it was finished, it was opened as the Elizabeth Line, and it was named after the late Queen. And it's already influencing a further extension, which will be called the North-South Crossrail 2, which will link northern and southern London. It's been operational since May 2023. It cost about between 14 and about 19 billion pounds, so an enormously expensive project, mainly because you have to dig the tunnels underneath this existing city, and as a result of that, they have to be quite deep. But it has really, really revolutionized and improved travel significantly, in particular between one of the main opportunity areas, which is called Stratford, which is in the east, and Heathrow Airport in the west. So some of these areas that we're going to be looking at, this is the map of London's opportunity areas. So we have Old Oak Common and Park Royal in the northwest. We have Vauxhall Nine Elms Battersea near the center, Thamesmead in the east. And then also I didn't put it on here, but we will be also talking about Stratford. Um, so opportunity areas really developed in London, starting in the late 1970s. The first and probably most famous one was Canary Wharf, which was set up as a development corporation. And development corporations in the UK are established as bodies that are publicly owned, but they're run like private companies, and they have planning powers. So it's seen as a more efficient way to develop a large scale site. So that really has more or less completed, although it's still filling up even as we speak. So that's been going on for about 30 years. King's Cross, St. Pancras started in the 1990s. That's still moving forward. Stratford, which was the site of the 2012 Olympics. There's, as I mentioned before, the wider Thames estuary. There's an area in South London called Elephant and Castle, which is currently going through a very long-term urban regeneration. Vauxhall Nine Elms Battersea since 2007. This is interesting because this is a partnership between the GLA and two London boroughs, Lambeth and Wandsworth, with oversight from Westminster City Council because of heritage issues. Westminster is on the other side of the river. And then Old Oak Common, which we will also talk about, the Old Kent Road, Thamesmead, and Abbey Wood. So this is where some of these things are located in the city. So this is central London. So you can see Stratford is kind of on the northeastern side, almost directly north of Canary Wharf and the Isle of Dogs. You have King's Cross, St. Pancras to the west. That's on the northern edge of central London. You have Vauxhall Nine Elms Battersea, which is on the sort of southwestern edge of central London, and Old Oak Common, which is a bit further to the west. So I'm going to talk about King's Cross. It's important to understand that even though we use the term strategic planning, in the UK, strategic planning isn't exactly planning in the way that we would think of it. It's not development control. It's actually urban design undertaken at the scale of the city or the region. So although you're not really designing individual buildings, you are designing and setting out where these big developments will happen and even what will happen within them. So King's Cross, St. Pancras, you can see the image on the upper left-hand corner there that shows what the site looked at looked like before it was built out. And you can see these images of Granary Square and the gasometers showing basically what the site looks like now. And this is sort of the center of the regeneration, an area along a canal called Regent's Canal. So just to give you a little bit of a background about King's Cross, it was primarily farmland before it was developed in the late 18th century. It was originally called Somerstown after a development that was initiated by the landowner called the Earl of Somers in the 1760s. The first bit of infrastructure that was developed in the area was the canal, which was built in the 1820s. And then really industrialization starts to kick off in the middle of the 19th century with the construction of two large railway terminuses. The first was King's Cross, and the second in 1868 was St. Pancras. Around these two railway stations were large kind of industrial lands, um, goods yards, and other associated facilities for that handled, um, you know, general goods and products and things that were moved about. Um, for example, fish, potatoes, grain. And it was really a very important part of the city in terms of railway infrastructure up until about World War II. But following the war, along with quite a bit of the rest of London and more widely in the UK, there was an industrial decline. Um, and it declined from this what was known as kind of an industrial working class neighborhood um, into one which slowly became abandoned. By the 1980s, it was pretty notorious for prostitution, drug abuse, and illegal raves. And this kind of impeded efforts to revive the area. Um, Even though it had huge land holdings, which were kind of ripe for redevelopment. You can see on the right there are the images of both King's Cross at the top and St. Pancras at the bottom, and how they've been redeveloped. But in the 1980s, artists and musicians were attracted to the area because the area had cheap rents. And in 1992, the first sort of community trust took over some of the facilities and incorporated a ecology center. And this kind of became a community hub. At the same time, one of the big warehouses, which is now called the Cold Drops, Bagley's warehouse was a venue for nightclubs in the 1990s and the early 2000s, right up until about 2006, I believe. And this is now a major shopping center, not shopping center, but a shopping development. Regeneration really started to kick off in the 1990s, and this was set up through what was called the King's Cross Partnership. And what really helped drive this was in 2000, it was decided that High Speed One, which was the first high-speed railway in the UK, would terminate at St. Pancras. So, being one of the two main railway stations, that provided a huge impetus for redevelopment. So they established a King's Cross partnership, and this was really to sort of fund regeneration. Um, Argent was the development partner. Um, and as I said, St. Pancras was the terminus for High Speed One. High Speed One was the UK side of the Eurostar link, which is the high-speed train which links Paris and London, which opened in 1994. In 2007, it moved from its temporary terminus at Waterloo Station on the south side of the river to St. Pancras. The master plan was set out by two architecture firms. One was Allies and Morrison, the other one was Porphyrius Associates. And in 2006, they applied for what's called outline planning permission. Outline planning permission means that you set out the sort of fundamentals of the master plan, but it's not detailed. And that was approved in 2006. And then in 2008, a further partnership for development between Argent, London and Continental Railways, and DHL was formed. And it's really important to talk about the extensive public realm scheme that has been incorporated. You can see some of that in some of the images here. Most particularly Granary Square, which is the center or the heart of the development, that is well known for its computer programmed fountains, but also a number of other open spaces. It's still a focus for major redevelopment, even now in the 2020s. In 2017, Google, which already had occupied a large office building between the two stations, basically decided to build a new headquarters and has invested over £1 billion to do that. And it's a because there are no tall buildings in the area because it's a conservation area. It's a very dense building and it's built along one of the railways, and it's been referred to as a groundscaper because although it's not tall, it's still quite dense and quite long. So that's still under construction. It's going to open quite soon. And then there's a lot of companies that are now headquartered in the area, as well as trade unions. Um, Quite a bit of cultural institutions have flocked to the area since the 1990s, including the London Canal Museum. British Library opened a new headquarters just to the west of St. Pancras in 1997. The Gagosian Gallery moved to the area in 2004. The Wellcome Trust, which is a cancer research institute, moved to the area about 10 years ago, and they have a major facility just to the north of the British Library. There's the London Sinfonietta and the Orchestra in the Age of Enlightenment, as well as two major newspapers, The Guardian and Observer, are headquartered in the area as well. And then most importantly, I would say in 2011, the University of the Arts London moved into the Granary complex, which you can see in that lower right-hand corner there. That's the Granary warehouse. So that's where they are based. And they're a major kind of anchor sort of tenant for the regeneration. And these are images of various areas in the site, including the high-speed trains in St. Pancras. Some of the open spaces, you can see the coal drops there where all the people are, and Granary Square on the lower right-hand corner, and the gasometers, which have been turned into housing. The second case study I'm going to talk about is Stratford, and this is important because this was another area of London that was industrial and very much a working class neighborhood. Was chosen for regeneration, and that was linked to the 2012 Olympics, and that kind of kick-started the urban regeneration of that area in the early 2000s. And that includes not only the site that you can see there, the stadium, the former athletic village, and the Westfield Shopping Center, but also the canal and the former Olympic Park itself, with elements like the ArcelorMittal, which is that tower, which is designed by, who's the architect? I can't think of his name, it's the artist. It'll come back to me. So Stratford is a very old settlement, was originally situated along what became known as the Great Essex Road, which was originally a Roman road. Name was first recorded in the 9th century, sorry, the 11th century. As a straight forda, which just literally meant a ford on a Roman road. And this was because it had this location along the River Lee. In the 12th century, Queen Matilda, the wife of Henry I, ordered a bridge to be built there. And that really sort of started the um, generation of what would have originally been a village, basically. And this was kind of linked to some religious houses, an abbey that was nearby. But the area really took off with industrialization. And this was kind of building off of the back of its noteworthiness as an area for agriculture in the up until the mid 19th century. And there had been a couple of porcelain factories in the area, around the area of the bridge there. Um, but really in the Victorian era is when industrialization took off. And this was really through three different things. The first element was the Metropolitan Building Act of 1844, which restricted dangerous and noxious industries from the metropolitan area, and the border was the River Lee itself. So that pushed quite a few of those dangerous industries across to the other side of the river. The second thing was, of course, the arrival of railways and then the creation of the nearby Royal Docks. So area is north of the Thames in East London. And during this period, of course, London was the premier port for the British Empire. So there were a number of docks that were built as a result of that. And this was quite strategically located near those. And there were a series of factories that were built in this area, which was quite marshy at the time. And Stratford itself was a local transport hub with what were called omnibuses and coaches running in various directions. Um, and there were even a series of steam coaches that plied routes into London from the 1830s. Um, but really, it was the construction of the Victoria Dock and the later Royal Docks complex that kind of initiated urban development, large scale urban development, as well as the opening of the Stratford Railway in 1839, which was quickly followed by the county's railway in 1840. And a large railway depot was built there in the 1840s, which employed about 2,500 workers. So this meant that you needed to build a large area for people to live, and a new town was developed. This new town was originally called Hudson Town. It was later known as Stratford Newtown, and by the middle of the 19th century had a population of about 20,000 people. Um, so this kind of started and really developed the history of the area, or the character of the area, as being largely industrial, very working class. But again, as the 20th century progressed, the area started to lose its industries. And this was particularly true after World War II. Um, and sort of compounding this deindustrialization was the closing of London docks in the 1960s, which led to a major change along the Thames estuary. The reason this happened was, and it was happening in many port cities around the world, the reason this happened was because um, the advent of larger container ships in the 1960s meant that you needed to build port facilities that were much deeper. And that meant that old kind of 19th century port facilities near city centers were not deep enough or big enough. And this was what was leading the change. So around this time, they were already starting to consider some various efforts to regenerate the area. And the first thing they did was they built a shopping center in the 1960s. But it was really the winning bid for the 2012 Olympic Games in the early 2000s that kicked off large-scale urban regeneration work. And it was really key to the bid was this idea of regenerating a deprived area of London. What was included as part of the regeneration was what was called the Westfield, which is a major new shopping center. It's essentially a shopping mall. The 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games, redevelopment of Stratford Station, but also the incorporation of a new high-speed railway station called Stratford International. So major transport infrastructure. And as part of that, a new DLR station was built. This DLR is the Docklands Light Rail. That's the railway system that was established when uh, Canary Wharf was built in the 1980s. And this station was partly redeveloped to incorporate the new Elizabeth line, which is there now. There were a number of large developments. First of all was the former Athletes Village, which became a major new residential quarter, a number of tall buildings, mostly residential. So that includes 150 High Street, Manhattan Loft Gardens. There's also a development called Sugar House Island, which is a 26-acre development comprising 1,200 new homes. And what's interesting about this is because of the housing pressures in London, the policy for new housing calls for a certain percentage of not only affordable housing, which, by the way, now is 50% of all new large-scale development has to be affordable. But in this case, they committed to 40% of the housing being what's called family housing, which means that they're 3-bed or 4-bed housing. They also included a new school, a 350-bed hotel, as well as other amenities for local residents and 2,500 new jobs. Then you have Morgan House, which is the southern end of Stratford Center, which included a new office tower, a hotel, and various other residential towers between 20 and 40 stories. And these are some images of what the site more or less looks like today, although there's a couple images there during construction. Now I'm going to talk about another opportunity area called Vauxhall 9 Elms Battersea. Opportunity Area Planning Framework. That's what the OAPF stands for. And this is really an interesting one because it's highly contingent on tall building development, more so than in any other opportunity area in London. What's interesting is that, obviously tall buildings, they're not new. They are pretty ubiquitous in many world cities, including Jakarta. But as I said earlier, London, they're more recent to London. But over the past 15 to 20 years, they've been becoming the norm increasingly in London. Although we're still not a vertical city yet. And that's because the typology, while it has become established, it hasn't really taken over yet. But that is the direction the city is moving in. And really, over the past decade, you've had a number of tall buildings that have been built in London. Um, and all of these are over 100 meters in height. But this is in addition to really more than 600, actually, about 650 tall buildings which are planned for the city, and another sort of 500 in the pipeline, which has really increased significantly over the last decade. And these are images of, for example, the Shard, which is the 310-meter tall tower at London Bridge Station on the South Bank. You have Canary Wharf, in the lower left-hand image. The lower central image is the South Bank, which is becoming a new mini cluster. The upper right-hand image is the city, which is the traditional area where most tall buildings had been. And then lower right-hand is in Stratford. So what's happening is you're getting a lot of clusters of tall buildings in different parts of the city. And this kind of fits in with London's key development strategy, which incorporates many, many different things, mostly opportunity areas, areas of intensification, but it also has to do with where the airports are located, specific new town centers. So those are kind of nodes of activity, and also public transport. What you can see is the locations for tall buildings across London. Most of those are focused around the Thames, but there are areas that are outside of that. And most of them are in and around the London CAZ, or CAZ, which is the Central Activities Zone. That's a special planning area which is meant to um, promote and retain important development in the West End of London. That's kind of the sort of commercial and cultural heart of the city. And then at the same time, you have these really important kind of cultural and historic monuments. So you have the Palace of Westminster, which is um, the Houses of Parliament. You have St. Paul's Cathedral and the Tower of London, which is the huge fortress on the eastern side of central London. And then you can see you have all these opportunity areas and then some areas for intensification. So the kind of idea behind where tall buildings can go in London, two of these areas that they can be in are opportunity areas and areas of intensification. But also the central activity zone. They should be located near town centers and specifically adjacent to public transport nodes. So this is what the London plan sets out for tall building development. The problem with that, though, is that London doesn't really say exactly where tall buildings should go, and it doesn't say where they shouldn't go. However, it does have some kind of de facto guidance. One of them is a kind of heritage framework, which is called the London View Management Framework, or LVMF, which is designed to protect historic views across the capital. particularly from hilltops and along the River Thames. So this is things like views of the Houses of Parliament, views of the Dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, things like that. Um, as part of this, there is an infrastructure plan to 2050, which calls for densification of the central activity zone, expansion of intensification into inner London, um, and its edges. So this is in various opportunity areas, including some of the ones I've already talked about, like Stratford, and ones that I am talking about now, like Vauxhall, Nine Elms, Battersea, and Old Oak Common, and generally a shift from west to east. So particularly in along the Thames estuary and the London Docklands over the past 30 years. So the Vauxhall Nine Elms Battersea, or VNEB, is an opportunity area, but it's also one that has a planning framework. So it has this OAPF designation, and to confuse you, it's the VNEB OAPF. Anyway, this was really initiated in response to a number of development pressures. This was one of the last large-scale pieces of urban land adjacent to central London. And what started this process was ongoing multiple schemes to redevelop the historic Battersea Power Station, which none of which had been successful. It was also spurred on by a decision by the US government to locate its embassy to the area from Mayfair. And then also development at Vauxhall, at St. George's Wharf and St. George's Tower. And then of course the fact that the land itself is very valuable. So you can see there the boundary of the opportunity area in relation to central London. It's quite big. You can see compared to the historic city how large it is. You can see its proximity to the Oval Cricket Ground and Westminster with the Houses of Parliament, Buckingham Palace, and the royal parks there. So it's quite close. So it has a real sort of strategic importance to central London. It's kind of a gateway into the city from the west. This is an image showing two things. First of all, is the boundary of the opportunity area itself, and the other one is CGMA, which is Covent Garden Market Authority, um, and its surplus development. And one of the reasons for highlighting that is that the new Covent Garden Market was the largest master plan of this opportunity area and was really kind of the most important element of that, apart from the power station. And I worked on that when I was at SOM, so that's one of the reasons I'm quite familiar with this project. So this is what the area looked like in 2012. You can see there's a mixture of industrial warehouse market facilities, pretty much low rise, and quite a bit of social housing, which in the UK is referred to as council housing because it was traditionally provided by local authorities, which are called councils in the UK. Just a couple of years later, a few more images showing looking the opposite direction, so you can see the sort of big box warehouse typology that was really prevalent on the site, and also looking from another angle there. This is the area today. You can see it's changed significantly. This is what the area will look like when it's finished in a few years. It's slated to be completed by the late 2020s or the early 2030s. And it has really become the second largest tower cluster in London after Canary Wharf. So it's actually usurped the tower cluster in the city in terms of its sheer volume and size. But why was it developed? Well, they had a few different arguments, which were sort of seen as quote unquote sustainable development arguments. The first one was a transit-oriented argument that in of itself created a call for high density and tall building development. So again, the idea that tall buildings should be located around major public transit nodes. The idea that high density equals walkable, dense, and sustainable communities. And then the context of new tall building clusters emerging across London. So Vauxhall, Nine Elms, Battersea being one of them, but also Blackfriars, London Bridge, Stratford, Old Oak Common. So as part of the Opportunity Area Planning Framework, they will deliver or are delivering 18,000 new homes. 3,500 of these are directly adjacent to Vauxhall Interchange. 22,000 jobs created during construction and 25,000 more over the course of the development. 1 billion pounds of investment to an extension of the Northern Tube Line. 45 million pound improvement to Vauxhall Tube Station and the gyratory, which is a roundabout there, where there is an existing bus station. Improved social infrastructure, 2 new schools, 50 acres of parkland and public open space, a river walk, cycling and walking trails, and a new pedestrian bridge that would link the area to Pimlico in Westminster. So this is just one of the master planning diagrams, um, which starts to show how this development would be laid out. You can see the Battersea Power Station on the western side there, River Thames to the north, and Vauxhall to the east. So really, this is a very good example of post-industrial waterfront development, starting around the power station and then kind of percolating over to the east to Vauxhall Interchange. The master plan, which you can see here, had a few spatial strategies. So the first one was revitalizing the power station itself and its surrounding development, linking that physically to the existing transport interchange at Vauxhall, which is over to the east. And that's done through this park. So you have a new network of green open spaces. It would function as a new urban corridor and a major destination in London, and then that certainly has become the case. And then they really wanted to keep the existing New Covent Garden Market within the area, but it needed to change and be redeveloped. So that's something that happened. These are diagrams that looked at the options for how the Northern Line extension could be done. And this was really important because it was seen that the power station wouldn't be successful unless it had a tube station. And they spent 1.2 billion pounds extending the Northern Line by 2 stations, one at Nine Elms and the other at Battersea. So this just shows that Northern Line extension there. So one of the sustainable design principles was improved public transit, which reduces car use and CO2. So through the extension of the Northern Line, as well as new bus routes in the area. So transit-oriented rather development was really seen as necessary to underpin the development of the power station or the redevelopment. But then this became an argument for tall buildings and higher densities in the opportunity area. Because so, we need an extension to the tube line to make the power station work. And then off of the back of that, developers were saying, well, we need tall buildings because this is a major transport interchange. And what happened was this led to a major new tall building cluster of heights upwards of 200 meters, which, although not that tall for global cities, is quite tall for London. And this shows you the tall building cluster itself. Most of these buildings have been completed now. There's only, I think, about 5 of them still to be completed. But the tallest is over 200 meters. And this shows you kind of a 3D of the development around the Battersea Power Station, going all the way up to Vauxhall, where the tall building cluster is. You can see the market, which has been redeveloped, and all the mid-rise development in between, which is also quite high density in of itself. Um, and then this is about understanding the relative height of the new tall building cluster as it was envisaged, as it was developing, actually. And then this question of, well, how do you actually design and build a new tall building cluster? Because obviously it wasn't there before. So, because New Covent Garden Market was the largest of the master plans, apart from Battersea Power Station, and it incorporated 3 of the skyscrapers. We kind of led the development of the formation of the cluster of tall buildings. And one of the things that we did was by studying other existing tall building skylines. So, for example, Hong Kong and Chicago. And it's really about understanding the difference between sort of context, um, marker buildings, and tall landmarks, and the fact that you have to have some elements which are taller, and then a kind of a body or plinth that they sort of sit on. But also the fact that the way that you view the cluster changes depending on where you're located and what side you're on, and that it needs to be considered basically in 3D. It has to be seen from all sides. And you can see this image from the River Thames showing what the cluster would look like once it was finished. So you can really see and get a sense of the impact of these changes, not only of the tall buildings themselves, but the mid-rise buildings as well, which are also quite tall. The London View Management Framework also had a huge impact on the location and formation of this tall building cluster. And what was really important was the idea that we didn't want to impinge on the Palace of Westminster. So that's a historic view that's protected by the LVMF. And it meant that we needed to find a way to design the buildings in the master plan so that you wouldn't see them poking up behind the silhouette of the palace. And so this building was chosen, which is called the Millbank Tower, and that was designed to be or designated as a sort of datum. And the datum went through that building. And what that meant was buildings to the west of that line would be behind the palace as you would view it from along the river. And that meant that building heights could only be a maximum of 70 meters. If they were taller than that, they would be visible above the building silhouette. Buildings to the east of that line would not impinge on the silhouette of the palace. And so building heights were designated to be up to 150 meters. Later, that was increased to over 200. So that's essentially how you ended up with the tall building cluster and the redevelopment at Vauxhall Nine Elms. Looking at Old Oak Common, this is another area that has been undergoing regeneration and redevelopment in recent years, and is a particularly difficult site to redevelop. It is nevertheless one of the largest urban regeneration schemes in the UK. But the site was essentially previously comprised of railway depots, a traction maintenance depot, alongside a park and prison. And then to complicate things, there's a canal, the Paddington Canal, which splits the site into two areas. So there's a lot of level changes and infrastructure passing through the site. The London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham launched the Park City Royal Plan, which included a new Crossrail station for what is now known as the Elizabeth Line, and a high-speed rail link for HS2, which is high-speed 2, which is the second high-speed rail corridor between London and Birmingham. That would go through the site. So that created the impetus for redeveloping this. And off of the back of that, they decided that they would look at the tube stations that would need to be renovated as well. So it was really this location of this new high-speed rail station alongside the new Elizabeth Line station that needed to be built that generated the impetus for redevelopment in this area of London. So this is where Old Oak Common and Park Royal Opportunity Area are located. So they're north of Hammersmith and Fulham, west of Westminster, Kensington and Chelsea. So you can see it's a bit removed from central London. So the Development Corporation was established in 2015 to lead the regeneration and planning work for the opportunity area, and it's called the Old Oak and Park Royal Development Corporation. And it will provide 65,000 new jobs and 25,000 new homes by 2041. Since 2019, over 500 homes have already been delivered. And the original opportunity area was designated in 2004. And an additional 3,500 homes have been completed. 40% of these are affordable. So altogether, about 4,000 of the 25,000 homes have been developed already. This is just where the Old Oak Common and Park Royal Opportunity Area is located in terms of where other opportunity areas are in London. So you can see there's quite a lot, a lot of them. You can see Elephant and Castle there, and Vauxhall Nine Elms Battersea on the lower right-hand side. And the river there. So there's quite a lot of other things going on, but they're all sort of linked through transit-oriented development. This is what the site looked like when it was originally designated. So you have to the west there the employment zone, and the right you have the Old Oak Common itself. The employment zone, it's important to say they didn't have any plans to change that. That was always seen as something that needed to stay because it's an important employment zone. So the policy was designed to improve it and sustain it and to keep it there. whereas the common was the area that would really be redeveloped. And this is just the complicated land ownership owned by a number of public and private entities, as well as the sort of complex level changes and infrastructure that make the site quite difficult to be redeveloped. Nevertheless, there were some basic design development concepts. One was this green cross, which was linking the park in the south to Harlesden Town Center to the north, and then east and west along both the canal and between these these various transport nodes. This is the massing of the site, so you can see quite a lot has changed from what was a primarily an industrial zone before that. They've created a series of mid-rise and lower high-rise buildings that sort of face onto Wormwood Scrubs Park there. The prison, which you can see on the other side of the park, has been redeveloped as an art museum, actually. So the area is changing quite a lot. And then, of course, there you can sort of see it there in the distance is the new high-speed railway station, and then on the other end here to the lower right-hand corner is where the tube stations are. Some renderings of what the area will look like when it's finished. These are really prioritizing pedestrian networks and active travel, as well as buses and other forms of public transport. This is the proposed land use, so primarily residential with transport nodes along what they refer to as the new High Street. Um, the um, the Park Royal employment zone there, and then some town center uses. Uh, so one of the challenges with this site is it's very difficult to plan because of the various bits and pieces of infrastructure there. So the various railways and level changes there, including roadways that pass through. And because of that, that meant that this sort of high street that they planned couldn't be a straight high street. It needed to kind of zigzag. Um, so it's not it's not the necessarily best case scenario, but they did what they could with the the existing um, topography and conditions. The overall grid plan is quite irregular and lacks legibility. So, and it is only partly permeable because of, again, these boundaries, these barriers of the canal and the various infrastructure that passes through the site. But again, you have basically these four transport nodes. It's unfortunate that they were not able to physically link all of the different stations together. And again, you have this kind of zigzag of the stations of the high street itself. These are some of the other open spaces that are being realized as part of the opportunity area. And you can see the precedents that were used, actually most of which came from other parts of London. So the idea that London has actually delivered good quality public open space in its own right. These are the proposed densities, so the highest being around the transport nodes and the absolute highest being around the high-speed station. So what they call commercial densities, and then the highest residential density being about 550 units per hectare, the lower ones being about 300. And then just some questions here. Really, is this the right quality for a high street in London? Um, doesn't really look like a high street. It's not really that commercial. It's more corporate in feeling. And will there be this much activity there? And these are the various stations that are being realized as part of the redevelopment and the Old Oak Common Station itself, which appears to be very suburban in character. Right. Okay, so I'm just gonna pass through here. I'm gonna quickly talk about Thamesmead and Abbey Wood. This was a very large scale development built in the 1960s, in Southeast London on what was a floodplain. It was designated as an opportunity area within the last 10 years, and it abuts two different London boroughs. One is Greenwich, the other is Bexley, and it's sitting in a curve of the river. Area is primarily comprised of social housing built between the 1960s and 1980s on former marshland on the south bank of the River Thames. Previously, the land was what was called the Royal Arsenal site. It was where the military undertook training exercises, about 1,000 acres or 4 square kilometers of land. Um, right. So I won't spend too much time, but the land, which used to be marshland, has been filled in, um, although a little bit of it has been left as waterways. But basically, the site was developed in the 60s as quite experimental. They were very experimental with the architecture, um, and they were really trying to resolve social problems that had existed on earlier social housing estates. And it was believed that this was because people had been uprooted from close-knit working class communities and sent to housing situated a great distance away. In this case, that also happened. So they were still sort of repeating that problem. And it kind of created a sense of isolation from the working class areas that they had lived in inner London. And it was very far, it was very poorly connected. And it lacked many of the amenities that were necessary for a large scale community like that. Um, Nevertheless, they prioritized family members for new housing. And that was an effort to try to keep some of these communities together. Um, there were a few radical ideas that were utilized. Robert Rigg from the Greater London Council was the architect. He took some ideas from Sweden, mostly around using waterways and lakes and things to reduce vandalism and antisocial behavior. That's because they felt that water was a calming influence. And it was really designed with what they thought were very futuristic ideas at the time, which looked quite impressive from afar, but less so up close. And really that was around things like elevated walkways, elevated buildings on piloti. But they didn't really work. The walkways became abused. They were poorly lit. and essentially and dark at night, and they had a lot of blind ends and corners, so people could hide in them, and they very quickly degenerated into antisocial and criminal behavior. Um, Footpaths also ignored pedestrian design lines that would, you would, as a pedestrian, you would want to walk in a certain direction, and the planners tried to design for pedestrians rather than designing uh, in the way that they actually would use spaces. Um, so one of the reasons they lifted everything up off the ground was because of the flooding problem. And that meant that you could create this kind of ground level garage space. Um, First residences were occupied in the late 1960s, but from the very beginning, there were problems with the construction. People had leakages. Um, Up until about 1974, most of the area was a mix of modernist townhouses and medium-rise 12-story tower blocks. And all of this was built in concrete using modular prefabricated construction. Um, and some of these have been used in films because of the dystopian futuristic look of these places. Um, Later on, they changed the building typologies into more brick because it was felt that um, the um the modular concrete construction was too brutal. There have been a few proposals for the extension of the Jubilee line through Thamesmead, but eventually this was not what happened, and it was extended to Stratford. So that was a very early impetus for redevelopment at Stratford. So the area continued to be cut off from the rest of the city until um, the um, the new Elizabeth Line station was built recently. There have been lots of discussions about building new river crossings. So far, that hasn't happened. And the only other plans for connecting the area are around the Docklands Light Rail, or the DLR, which is seen as the most viable way of getting another form of public transport there. Um, there are buses, but of course, getting across London on buses is extremely slow. Um, One of the most significant design failures was the lack of shopping facilities and local services. And the two areas themselves were actually cut off from each other um, by a road, a motorway, and a railway line. Um, However, over time, some facilities developed, including a supermarket and a small retail park. Bus services have been improved, and now people can reach the railway station. But of course, it's too far to walk. One of the technologies that was pioneered in Thamesmead was district heating and originally cable radio, but it was decommissioned around the year 2000 because it didn't work very well. Um, Most of these areas have now been demolished and they're being redeveloped. Um, so, but you can get a sense of the type of architecture that was built in these communities. It's being replaced with far more traditional typologies, kind of contemporary vernacular, which utilizes more traditional typologies like terrace housing. They're built on the ground and have a traditional relationship to the street. Um, right. So these are just a few more images of the development as it looked when it was being built. A little bit about the Elizabeth line there. So the Greenwich part of Abbey Wood has a population of just over 13,000. And so what that shows you is that the transport infrastructure is really important for the area. You can see some more of the new developments, blocks of flats, again, houses, terrace houses, in these new areas that are being built. This one is called Galleon's Housing, Galleon's Reach, um, which is an eco park, 14.3 acre public open spaces adjacent to it, and it's near the river. The South Mere, which is the area around the artificial lake, uh, has been largely rebuilt over the last few years by Peabody Housing Trust. And they are changing the building typologies and retrofitting the existing ones to work better. And this was initiated in 2015 by the mayor, which called for 2,800 new homes. And they created two zones, Abbeywood and South Thamesmead, and Abbeywood, Plumstead, and Thamesmead. They're delivering 20,000 new homes, increasing the number of residents to about 80,000. And of course, in addition to the Elizabeth Line station, they are extending the Docklands Light Rail. So you can see where that's located in London and within the wider Thames estuary opportunity area. And you can see that here in a little bit more detail. You can see the very suburban quality of this part of London. And this is just a little bit about the opportunity area planning framework, but I'm going to just skip through this so that we can get on to New York. So this is just a reminder of some of those opportunity areas that we looked at in London, and that you can find all of this in the Urban Design Journal. You can find my details here. I can share this presentation with Bagas so that you guys can look through it in detail. The second city, and of course we're running out of time, but the second city I wanted to talk about, of course, was New York, which is in this region of about 560 million people. In the United States, 330 million people. Depending on how you measure it, it's either the first or second largest economy. Sixth highest per capita GDP, so quite wealthy. New York is located within New York State, which was interestingly settled around the same time as Batavia in Jakarta, also by the Dutch initially in 1614. Swedish came along in 1650, and then the English in the 1660s. And then from that point on, it was part of the English and later British empires. And then in the 1780s, of course, it became part of the United States. This gives you a sense of New York State itself and where the city of New York is located within that. It's actually the 5 counties that are coterminous with the city's 5 boroughs. And this is part of the what we call the Northeast Megalopolis, or the Northeast corridor between Washington, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. And you can see, of course, New York City. It's generally considered the second largest urban agglomeration in North America after Mexico City. And the tri-state area, which is, depending on the figures that you look at, between about 20 and 23 million people. so a bit smaller than Jakarta. The city of New York is seen as an Alpha plus plus city, along with London. Alpha plus would include Tokyo, one of the two or three top world financial centers. Has the two largest stock exchanges in the world, the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ. Has a gross metropolitan product of $1.33 trillion. And Midtown Manhattan is the largest central business district in the world with 37.2 million square meters of office space. As I said, it is right around about 8.5 million people. It's the largest city in the United States and comprised of 5 boroughs. Has the largest metropolitan transit system in the US. 8.6 million people ride it daily, although that figure is pre-COVID. So it's quite a bit less than that now. But they have 16 commuter rail routes, 310 bus routes, 25 mass transit routes, 2,300 commuter rail cars. New York City subway is the 9th oldest in the world. It opened in 1904. It's the 4th longest in the world at 375 kilometers, has 422 stations, runs 24 hours per day, 365 days per year. And the subway itself has 5.65 million people who ride it daily. Obviously, the city started in the 17th century under the Dutch, and the first architecture was Dutch in character. In the early 17th century, by the time the British had taken over, the city had acquired a very London typology of Georgian terrace houses. So this is what the city looked like in the 18th and early 19th centuries, still quite provincial. Quite a few grids, none of which really, they were all sort of oriented in different directions. And they were not really designed in partnership until the early 19th century. And that was because each family that owned land, like in London, was really developing their own land holdings. But later on, of course, you have the Manhattan Grid, which is known as the 1811 or Commissioner's Plan, which changed that. So by the 19th century, the city is developing into this really high density typology. You're starting to see tall buildings appearing. Again, this is the 1811 Commissioner's Plan, which you can see here in this satellite image. And this is really a little bit about just how the city developed, starting in 1625, after the Dutch developed it up through the 19th century. Right. So the city was really a major destination for immigration from the 1830s to 1850s. There were 3 basic waves. 1880 was the beginning of the last sort of wave until the 1950s and 60s. And throughout these different waves, most of the immigrants came from various parts of Europe, initially from the British Isles, later from Southern and Eastern Europe. The US or New York was really the sort of hub of the railway system in the United States, and it was really the gateway to America. Interesting to note, during the third wave, 25 million people came to the United States. So really huge numbers of people, and this had a big impact on the city and the way that it developed. By 1890, the United States was the world's largest economy, continues to be so to this day, only eclipsed by by China if you look at purchasing power parity, or the EU in terms of total GDP. It was really a city of contrasts. This is an image of some of the palaces on Fifth Avenue during the Gilded Age. And then, of course, obviously the advent of skyscrapers in the early 20th century, which you can see here in Lower Manhattan in the 1930s. The first zoning plan was initiated in 1916, and that really had to do with how you develop land. So it's the U.S. uses a zoning-based system, so quite similar to Indonesia. And this is usually around land use, but it also has to do with three-dimensional development. The first zoning plan was about building height and setbacks, and that was really because of this building that was advertised before it was built, and it created shock because of the sheer size of the building. It ended up being built, but after that, the city passed the first zoning ordinance, which required setbacks to allow light to reach the street level. And there was a whole system of how that worked, building setbacks and so forth. Um, and that was further refined through the 1920s and 1930s. And there are a plethora of examples of this that are still standing in New York to this day. Currently, you can see in terms of tall buildings, there are sort of 3 or 4 clusters, the 2 main clusters, one in Lower Manhattan, the other in Midtown, and then a smaller one in downtown Brooklyn and Long Island City. And now the way building height is managed has to do with floor area ratio. I'm sure you're all very familiar with that, which is a more efficient way of dealing with building density. They also have this principle called transfer of development rights, which is where you can use air rights. And let's say, for example, if you're a church, you wouldn't build above the church, so you could actually sell those development rights to adjacent sites who could then build taller. That's basically how that works. So it's a very dynamic way of managing height and density across the city. And all of this is available through the New York City Planning Portal. You can see all kinds of things like zoning and land uses, limited height districts, discretionary tax incentives, and so forth. So I'm going to just quickly talk about some opportunity areas. They don't use this terminology in New York, so they're just large-scale developments, but essentially they work very similar to the way that they do in London. And the first is really around public space, Hudson River Park, which was developed from starting in the 1980s. There was a plan to, and it was a community-based initiative, which was looking at an elevated motorway, which was called the Westway. And people really, there was a small part of it that existed, and the city officials wanted to expand it. Community was galvanized against it and fought the expansion. They were successful, and as a result of that, they were able to form this local community organization that pushed for the redevelopment of this part of the island into parkland. It was initially established in 1998 and was built out in a number of different stages up through the 2020s, starting at Battery Park City in the south and going all the way up to Riverside Park in the north. So it connects various areas of the city. It's comprised of recreated piers that jut out into the river, cycle, pedestrian paths, um, foliage, landscaping, different uses in different areas. Stretches 4.5 miles or 7.2 kilometers, comprises 550 acres or 220 hectares. It's the second, that makes it the second largest park in Manhattan after Central Park, which is 843 acres or 341 hectares. It was a joint state and city collaboration organized as a state public benefit corporation, but it was initially, as I said, a result of grassroots community pressure. Right. So the park also includes tennis and soccer fields, batting cages, children's playgrounds, a dog run, and many other features. It incorporates some of the reconstructed piers, which were formerly used for shipping and ocean liners. This just shows you some of the different areas of the park. So it's actually quite narrow, and it is directly adjacent to the Hudson River Parkway, which is a parkway road, which was created after the Westway was torn down. Brooklyn Bridge Park is on the other side of Manhattan on Brooklyn. So it faces the city across the East River. This first phase opened in 2010. The land for the park was formerly industrial along the waterfront. Sorry, just give me a second. I just need to plug in my computer. Yeah, so it's built on formerly industrial land owned by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. The city and the state signed a joint agreement in 2002, and that allowed for the first site planning and project funding to commence. First works were initiated in 2007 at a warehouse underneath the Brooklyn Bridge, which included a residential project to help fund the project. The park was overseen by the Brooklyn Bridge Park Corporation, which is a nonprofit organization that operates and maintains the park and oversees construction. The park itself is 85 acres or 34 hectares. It was designed by Michael van Valkenburg Associates, landscape architects. It's located on a 1.3 mile long or 2.1 kilometer plot of land. And it includes a number of existing parks that were kind of all separated from each other, and incorporates a historic ferry landing and piers, all of which contain playgrounds and residential developments, and includes a number of former industrial buildings, including warehouses and stores from the 19th century. And it also incorporates the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenery, which is a plan for the entirety of the Brooklyn waterfront through a series of parks and cycle paths. And it's connected to ferry, bus, and subways. And this is an image of what the park looks like, and some images from the park. This is all part of what used to be called Vision 2020, is now called Vision 2050. And it is a comprehensive plan for the waterfront of the entirety of New York City. And the idea is really that all of the waterways in the city are physically and publicly accessible. So that means wetlands, that means rivers, canals, any any form of public right of way that is a waterway. And this was something that was initiated during the mayoral tenure of Michael Bloomberg and has continued because it is so popular. And it has also expanded to include sustainable um, and sustainable development, but also water resilience. One of the most important case studies and urban regeneration areas in New York is the Hudson Rail Yards, which you can see here, which is a site that has been developed on the west side of Manhattan. It is kind of like Vauxhall Nine Elms Battersea in London. It's one of the last areas of developable open land anywhere in the city. And it was basically developed over the top of the existing West Side rail yard. And that is, you can actually see it here. You can see the last phase of it, which is still visible there. To the east, the cylindrical building is Madison Square Garden. Underneath that is a railway station called Pennsylvania Station. And so you have the series of railway yards that were built to the west to service that. And there's also a series of tunnels which go under the river over to New Jersey. So this development was really built over the top of those railways as what you call an air rights development. The project started in 2012. The estimated completion is 2030. This is all at a cost of $20 billion. Some notable architects were involved, including KPF, Thomas Heatherwick, SOM, Foster and Partners, as well as Roche and Dinkeloo. The two main developers, the Related Properties and Oxford Properties. The site is 28 acres or 11 hectares. And as I said, much of the site is built as an air rights development on a platform over the existing Hudson Rail Yards, or also known as the West Side Yard. The site is north of Chelsea, south of Hell's Kitchen, and west of Midtown South. Right. And you can see some of the buildings that have been developed. You can see a little bit of the rail yards there, and also the High Line, which is this is where the northern terminus of the High Line is. Phase one opened in 2019. It included green open space, 8 buildings. Mostly towers, including residential accommodation, hotel, office buildings, shopping mall, and cultural facility. Also included the Heatherwick designed vessel, which you can see in the image to the right. Phase two was planned to open in 2023. I don't know whether it has opened yet. It might be slightly delayed because of COVID. When it is complete, it will include a residential development, office building, and school. The Hudson Rail Yards was actually originally intended for other developments, notably in the early 2000s, as a location for the West Side Stadium, which was part of New York's unsuccessful bid for the 2012 Summer Olympics. The successful redevelopment required agreement between a number of agencies. So the first is the federal government of the US. The second is the state of New York. Then you have the city of New York, the borough of Manhattan, the Metropolitan Transit Authority, Long Island Railroad, New Jersey Transit, Amtrak, which is the national railway company, the port, as well as the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. So quite a lot of coordination that needed to happen there to make that project successful. In 2012, New York had a visitor, and the visitor was Hurricane Sandy, and it caused extensive flooding throughout the city, about $75 billion worth of damage. And that meant people started to kind of wake up to the possibility that the city, which is located on the Atlantic Ocean, could be flooded due to rising sea levels because of climate change, if they don't do something about it. So this has meant that the city has started to look at tidal barrier parks and other ways of protecting itself from tidal inundation. So one of them is in Battery Park City. Another is in along the East River. You have this taking place in Brooklyn as well as Manhattan. So there's a number of projects here where the city is actually looking at how to deal with this problem of flooding and whether you can create areas of land that jut out from the waterfront that would contain flood water. Kind of like a giant sustainable urban drainage system. And this could actually create land for recreation and open green space when the land isn't flooded. So that's it. That's my discussion about urban design and in New York and in London. Do we have any questions?
Okay. Can you hear our voice, David?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Thank you for a very eye-opening lecture. A very eye-opening for me as well. And in here, actually, and at Zoom, there's also another lecturer, Mr. Pras. Thank you for attending the lecture. Okay, now we will move to the sessions. If there's any question from students? Yeah. So how many questions, Dave, are we allowed to give to you?
Well, as many as you want. Just keep in mind I have another meeting at 10, so we have about
Okay.
9 minutes worth of questions.
Okay. So one question. Yeah. Yes, continue then.
Okay, about the tall buildings that is made in London, especially in the PNED opportunity area, are there any challenge in developing the tall buildings around the heritage building in Westminster? Like, how do you preserve the iconic views of the heritage building?
So the way that the heritage was preserved was by creating the datum through the Millbank Tower. So by allowing so you see, I explained here. Hold on. Just bear with me. I showed you the diagram in. Right. So let's go back. So you have this principle of hold on, where is it? So it's a little bit difficult to see here, but in this image on the bottom of the screen, you see the Palace of Westminster to the right, and then as you go to the left, you see a tall building there.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so that building is called the Millbank Tower. Okay. If you look to the diagram to the right, you see there's a line, the red dotted line.
Yes.
The red dotted line goes through that building. Okay. So that building became a datum. A datum is like a threshold. Okay.
Okay.
So everything to the left of the building can be tall. So it can be a tall building. Everything to the right is limited in height. And that limit is 70 meters, right? You can see that here. So everything to the west is maximum 70 meters. Everything to the right can be taller. So that is the way that you protect the heritage, is by using the datum. So when you look down the river, you don't see a bunch of buildings popping up immediately behind the palace. You still see tall buildings, but they're not adjacent to it. They're a little bit of a distance away from it.
Okay. I think that's all the question from me. Thank you for your explanation.
You're
Okay,
welcome.
any other questions? Probably are you able to accept one more question, Dave?
Sure.
Okay, one more question. Anyone? Rere, you want to ask? No? No? Lagi. Okay, yeah, you have questions. This is the question. One.
Okay. Hi. I want to ask, so from what I've seen from your presentation, uh, all the opportunity areas are located near a river. Is there any reason for that?
No, that's not correct, actually. Not all of the opportunity areas are next to a river. You can see here that that isn't the case, actually.
Okay.
Yes, there are many that are located next to rivers, but not all.
I was just wondering. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, the reason that many of them are located next to rivers is because of the way the city developed historically. So you're right, some of them are next to rivers, but not all of them. But that's just a feature of how the city developed historically, and the fact that the river had a lot of industrial facilities along its length. And as the city abandoned its industrial facilities, this created land that became available for redevelopment. So it's just a function of where that land happens to be.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, thank you for your answer, Mr. Davis.
Sure.
Okay, I think we have one more question. Dave?
Okay.
Okay. Fikri, you want to ask?
Okay. First of all, good morning. Thank you for your presentation and explanation. It's very good for us as a junior urban designer. So I want to ask something. Um, Before the New York, you already explained about London. It's a city that developed with so deep about the historical or the preservation aspects. So from your perspective, from your perspective, what is the challenge that we face in the development of the historical or uh, preservation cities? Yeah, because right now in our urban design studio one, we already have sites that is historical sites in Braga at Bandung. So maybe you have tips and tricks or something that you can give to us about the historical aspects. Thank you.
You're welcome. I mean, I think, I mean, there are many challenges that that you have to deal with respect to heritage. You know, you can see it as a constraint, and indeed, in many cases, it is a constraint. However, the thinking has shifted quite a bit in recent years in the UK. And the UK has always had, well, not always, but let's say for the past 50 years or so, the UK has had quite strong heritage protection. And I would also say that parts of the US do. So cities like New York since the 1960s have had very strong heritage protection. But in the UK, I would say one of the things that we've begun to think about a lot is adaptive reuse. And the reason for that is due to climate change and due to the high carbon cost of constantly building new buildings, tearing down other buildings. That releases a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. Um, and the new types of concrete, which emit lower levels of carbon, is a lot more costly to use. So from a cost perspective, as designers, we are thinking much, much more carefully about where we demolish and how we can reuse. So that automatically is lending itself more to preserving heritage. Having said that, heritage protection is already quite strong in both London and New York. So it's not necessarily a case of having difficulty in preserving, although there are still some cases where buildings get torn down that are of heritage value. Most of the time this doesn't happen. The other thing I would say is that there isn't so much of a challenge in those cities with redeveloping those types of buildings, mainly because of the astronomical land value. So land is so valuable that basically nobody wants to leave it sitting around for too long because it's an opportunity to make money. So even though some developers can't afford it, there will be developers that can. So there are always going to be opportunities for any building, and it's just become part of um, the the industry, the building industry in our cities. And I think that that will eventually become the case in Indonesia as well, as it becomes more common and as land becomes much, much more valuable. What you'll see is actually, well, we can't tear this building down, it needs to be redeveloped. And then how you redevelop it becomes really key, because do you want to maintain certain aspects, or is it just about the facade? In some cities, only the facade of the building is preserved and everything else is redone. So, you know, and there are big debates about that. In the UK, we don't really do that, although there are some cases, but let's say it's quite common in places like Toronto in Canada, where they do this. And we even have a term for it. We call it facadism. So there are issues with that in other parts of the world.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Dave. Okay, before you leave, probably we can have a group picture. So how are you going to do this? So we stand next to the TV? Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry, give us 2 seconds. Okay, Dave?
Okay.
Probably put him on the center then. Oh, can you stop share screen, Dave?
What's that? Oh,
Can
stop
you
sharing.
share
Yeah.
screen?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to stand next to the TV. Okay, come on, everyone. Ya, dari situ. Pas di depan. Ini bisa taruh di tengah. Di depannya. Ah, oke. Keluar lagi. Sini, sebelah sini. Masih kosong Abian. Masuk semua nggak? Oke. In 3, 2, 1. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Again. Again. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Dave.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much.
Next time. Bye.
Bye.
Okay.
Take
Thank you,
care.
Papa.
Sama-sama. Terima kasih. See.
Lovely day. Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.